Welcome, class, to the dawn of the French Revolution. So, in our previous installments in this class, we've been looking at the build-up to the French Revolution. During the first month I had you, we focused on the early modern period, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Absolutism, otherwise known as the Age of Sail. Then we focused on the world of the 1750s, getting you acquainted with the maritime empires of Britain and France. In the last week or so, we've been focusing very hard on the Enlightenment, this new intellectual movement sweeping the European continent that is bringing about major mental shifts in the way people look at the natural world, at religion, at politics. Now we are reaching the French Revolution. The time when these paradigm shifts, when these mental shifts in the way Europeans are viewing the world are put into concrete action in the form of violent political revolution. But first, the American Revolution. Alright, at this point you're probably thinking I had some technical error and that I accidentally recorded this on a slideshow I made for the US class. No, it is not. So, let's explain it, because the American Revolution actually has a major impact on the dawn of the French Revolution. So, rebellion against Britain. So after the 7 Years' War, as we discussed before, Britain, and France are both under colossal debts. Wars are expensive, and Britain and France had both been involved in multiple wars. And as a result of this, Britain found itself owing large amounts of money to various banks. So how does the crown pay for a war? So it raised taxes, and also began enforcing tax collection methods on its colonies that had not been exercised previously. The colonies rejected this. Remember this, you did American Revolution in 7th grade, you did it in 4th grade, so it should be ringing a few bells. If it isn't for anyone, don't worry. I'm gonna go over if when I get you for U.S. history, so don't even worry about it. But anyway, the colonies begin to resist the taxes, initially peacefully, then violent acts, destruction of property like the Boston Tea Party, tarring and feathering of tax collectors, which is actually a very deadly form of assault, because when you pour tar on someone, tar is very hot, so it burns the body before you put all the feathers all over them. They look ridiculous, like a giant chicken. But in order to scrub it off, you basically are scraping off not only the tar, but the skin as well. So the poor tax collector would usually die a few days later of infection. It's actually a rather terrible thing to do to another human being. It's actually pretty messed up. But anyway, eventually it's turned into outright rebellion with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolution had begun. Almost a year later, on July 4th, 1776, the colonies issue a formal document called the Declaration of Independence, where they explain to all the world why it is they're rebelling against Great Britain. Now, within a few years, France comes in to aid the colonies. Remember, France is the historic rival of Great Britain. The two countries have a long-running issue between each other that goes all the way back to the 100 Years' War, way back in the day, when the ruling families of Britain and France were at war. And this issue only heated up during the Reformation, and you had Catholic France against Protestant Britain. These two countries have a long history of warfare with each other. So naturally, when Britain's empire might be falling apart a little bit, France is eager to rush in and join the fight. Now, some individuals came early, before the government even allowed them to. So one was the Marquis de Lafayette, nobleman who joined the revolution in the winter of 1777. Marquis de Lafayette not only came on his own recognizance, but he even spent the dreadful winter at Valley Forge with Washington. Now, eventually the French do formally join the war on the American side. The French fleet distracts the British Navy, actually causing war, starting fights and provoking movements in the West Indies and in the East that draw the British fleet away from the North American continent. Things finally come to a head when Comte de Rochambeau, French count, his picture is on the bottom of this page, leads the French fleet at the Battle of Yorktown, famously separating the British Army from the British Navy and facilitating the victory that the Americans would have thereafter, etc., etc. Yankee Doodle Dandy. No, I'm not kidding. They actually played that when the colonists won that battle. But anyway, we'll talk more about the Battle of Yorktown later, because the Battle of Yorktown really could be a lecture in and of itself. But this is global, not U.S., so we're not going to get into the Battle of Yorktown right now. So, the convening of the Estates General. Back to France. So, what's going on in France? France is actually in peril. Why? Well, France is struggling to pay the interest on its war debt. So, they're not even struggling just to pay the debt, they're struggling just to pay the interest. So, a little financial info for you guys. When you get a loan, that loan, the bank will charge you interest, which is an extra fee you have to pay back the bank when you repay the loan. Interests are given in percent, so if a loan has, say, 5% interest, that means if you borrow $200 from the bank, you got to pay them back $210 at the end. It's a fee that you have to pay for borrowing the money. And it's what makes it worth the while for the bank to lend out the money. At this point, France is just struggling to pay their interest on the debt. They're not paying down the debt, they're just paying off the interest, the extra fees on the debt. Now, they're in this position, and they decide that the best thing they can do is go to more war expenses to help the British colonies rebel against Great Britain. So the American Revolution only puts France further into debt. Now, it's not that there aren't rich people in France. Heaven knows there are rich people. The problem is a lot of them are members of the nobility. These are hereditary aristocrats, men who inherit their titles, dukes, counts, marquises, etc. And these gentlemen, under the French law, there was a law in place that said that the king could not raise taxes on the nobility without convening the Estates General. So it used to be the rule in France during the Middle Ages that the king could not raise taxes at all without convening the Estates General. When kings wanted to convene the Estates General less and less, they eventually struck a deal with the nobles. They said, well, instead, we'll raise taxes, but not on you. And we don't have to call the Estates General. The nobles agreed. So, as a result of this, some of the wealthiest people in France, the nobles, could not have their taxes increased unless the king convened the Estates General, which hadn't been convened in 2 centuries. Now, the famine occurred. So 1788 had been brutal, and the winter of 1788 to 89 was even more so. And as a result, there was massive famine. They didn't have a good harvest, so now there's not enough food. So popular unrest is growing. Why? Well, one, you don't got enough food. When people can't eat, they get angry. How many times have you gone down to the cafeteria, even here, and if staff hasn't started to get the food out, someone's yelling, hey, where's the food? Now imagine you haven't had food for several days or weeks. You're going to be pretty angry, pretty furious. Someone's got to pay for this. To make matters worse, because of the American Revolution, not only is the government in worse condition, but now you have many French soldiers who served over in the Americas, right? So they've been serving alongside the Continental regiments. So they've been hearing these Americans babble on and on and on about, freedom and liberty and et cetera, all this stuff about natural rights and stuff. And now they come back to France after fighting in that war, and they can't even afford a loaf of bread to feed their families. They're annoyed. They're angry. So popular unrest is growing in France. As mentioned, there are all these other Enlightenment ideals that have been circulating around that are making people more comfortable with questioning traditional authority and with questioning the institution of the monarchy and the way the government is run. So popular unrest is growing. Now, the Estates General. We got to talk a little about what the Estates General is and what it isn't. So the Estates General is a medieval assembly. This was an assembly of people, a group, a legislature, essentially, that existed in France since the Middle Ages. It was composed of representatives of the three legal social classes in France. So unlike America, where social class is a little fluid, like we have an idea, there's upper class, middle class, lower class, right? You got people that are wealthy, we got middle class folks, everyday folks, and then we got people that are poor. But there's a line, what is the divide between, upper middle class and wealthy? What is the rich versus the super rich? What is the dirt poor, the homeless, versus you're poor, but you're not that poor? It varies. People aren't really sure. Is rural poverty the same as urban poverty? Or is one a little richer than the other? This is a very fluid issue in the United States because there aren't really legally distinct social classes. In France, you have very legally distinct social classes. And French society was divided into three classes called estates. The first estate was the clergy. Now, it does not mean every cleric, every holy person, every person that practiced, that was the leader of a religion. No. What it meant was, like a priest or a rabbi. No. It was specifically the Catholic clergy, the Catholic priests and nuns and bishops, archbishops, etc. Because Catholicism was the official state religion of France. So, ironically, if you were a rabbi, you were actually part of the third estate. But I digress. So the clergy was the first estate in French society. The second estate was the nobility, those with the hereditary titles that we talked about earlier. The third estate is anyone who lacked titles made up the third estate. Now, the image we have of the third estate, often we picture, look at this, you got the clergy over here, we got our friar, and then in this image, we got our knight, second estate, and then look at the peasant for the third estate. That's the image we have in our mind. And that's kind of the myth. The myth is that the first estate was the privileged clergy, our wealthy spiritual leaders, our bishops, and our cardinals, and our abbots, men of wealth and leisure. And that the second estate was the wealthy nobles and the warrior aristocrats, these, pompous old military men and these wealthy, lavish nobles. And at the bottom you had the poor peasants, and the artisans, your blacksmiths and your cobblers and your tanners, just trying desperately to skate by. That's the myth. Here's the reality. The first estate was all clergy. So it was everything from your wealthy cardinals all the way down to the poorest mendicant friars, the guys who religiously weren't even allowed to own their own personal possessions. That was the first estate. The second estate just simply meant anyone with titles of nobility, regardless of their actual wealth. And by this point, there were even a few families that had been nobles during the Middle Ages that were actually pretty poor by this point. Their lands didn't really produce much, and the restructuring of the nation's military during the early modern period deprived many of these nobles of positions they had previously held back when France relied on warrior aristocrats like knights to protect for its national defense. The third estate technically was anyone without a title. So that meant everyone from your wealthiest of the burgher class, the bourgeoisie, as the French called them. So these are your wealthy businessmen, all the way down to your dirt poor peasants. It just meant you did not have an official title. You weren't a lord or a duke or a count or something like that. That was what was meant by third estate. There's a big deal of wealth difference within this class. Keep that in mind. That's going to become important later.